The best leaders have mastered this skill, and I am going to teach you how to do it as well. Today, we're talking about not centering yourself as a leader. This is one of the best leadership tips you'll ever get. And these are the kind of leaders that people remember for the rest of their lives, not just their careers and not just that one job tenure. And if you want to be that kind of leader as well, stay tuned because I'm going to talk about what it looks like to do it wrong and what it looks like to do it right. I also have to admit that this is something I've struggled with in my career, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. First, let's start off with a definition of centering. What is centering? Centering means placing yourself at the core of all decisions, goals, and conversations. It means that you're prioritizing your own needs and perspective over those of others. And if you think about how that can be detrimental in a leader, I think it's pretty obvious. A leader should be prioritizing the needs of the company and the needs of the people above their own self-interest. When a leader is centering themselves, this can show up as monopolizing conversations, speaking only of their own needs and feelings, and shutting down the needs and feelings of others, as well as making decisions without including the team and seeking credit for all successes. And I'm just going to be really vulnerable for a second and admit that there have been times where I struggled as a leader with not centering myself because I felt like the goals that were given to me by my leadership were so important that sometimes it was okay for me to steamroll over other people or not take in other perspectives because I'd been given my own marching orders and I was following through on that. And while that may have made me valuable in some ways, I would say that that definitely impacted my own ability to show up as a real leader and sometimes losing sight of the people in service to the mission or the goal of the company or the department that I was in. So that's something that I regret. I definitely regret that there are times that I had my own blinders on about what I saw as the goals I needed to hit to help the company. And I would have been better served getting more buy-in from my team. And if you think about it, a leader should be focused on developing and lifting up their team. What you don't want is a leader who thinks that their goals are more important than the team or more important than the company. And my own struggle was being so single-minded in my purpose that I lost sight of people along the way. I've seen other leaders struggle with this in a different way, where they were so focused on making their own individual bonus that they didn't care about doing other parts of their job that lifted up their team or that lifted up the teams around them so that they could support the business as a whole. And I think that that's really sad. And I think that you've seen this in executives too, where you hear about executives who are focused on making their bonuses, even if that means sacrificing people and making decisions that seem a little rough, and that is out of self-interest. It's not just for the benefit of the company, it's so that they can make their individual money. And that is very much centering oneself. So there's different ways that this can show up in damaging ways, but again, it is a very dangerous path to walk as a leader if you can't let go of centering yourself. There's a few different ways to make sure that you're not centering yourself as a leader, and these first ones are really easy checks to monitor yourself and to also ask yourself, am I currently doing these things? And just take a critical eye towards yourself and do some of that self-discovery to determine if this is something you're struggling with, or if you just need a few reminders about how to make sure not to do it. The first one sounds easy, but can be the hardest. And I'd say this is the one that I specifically struggled with myself as a leader, which is empowerment. Empowerment is giving your team members autonomy and trusting their capabilities. And not giving people autonomy can show up in a couple different ways. One is being a control freak. One is hiding your control freak tendencies by being a little maternal or paternalistic and saying somebody's not ready for something, therefore you can't trust them with those responsibilities. So empowering your team means making sure that you're giving people opportunities to grow and to prove themselves and to make mistakes in a safe space. The reason that this does involve centering yourself or not centering yourself is that, and again, being honest here, this is what I struggled with, is that as a leader, I would say they're going to risk our ability to achieve this goal or this target because I know they're not ready. And I might be right, but in that sense, I'm prioritizing what looks on paper to be my success as a manager of a team or a director of a team or whatever level you are, but you have results and targets that you're accountable for, but you still have to take a chance on people. And so if you're centering yourself, you're putting that target above, or that goal, you're putting that target or that goal above developing and empowering your team. Whereas as a leader, that's actually a balancing act. Yes, you do need to make sure that you are hitting your target, but you should be doing that through empowering or supporting your team so that they're part of hitting that target. It's not just on you to do so. I've seen other people struggle with this as well, where they won't delegate anything to their team. And delegation can come in different forms. When we think of delegation, a lot of times we think of delegating tasks or activities, but really as a leader, one of the things that you need to do is delegate authority so that you are growing leaders and giving them opportunities to learn by being in a decision-making role and by then learning from the outcomes. So this is a tough one. The empowerment one sounds like everyone's like, yeah, of course you should do this. But that's actually really, really hard, especially, like I said, if you've been in a situation where you've been solely accountable for your own successes and failures for so long and had to kind of claw your way up to the top, as it were. And then suddenly you're in a situation where you have to depend on people where you know they're not going to do it as well as you did, but you have to let them do it anyway. That's hard. That's really, really hard. So I would say if you're working on your leadership skills, take a really, again, critical lens at yourself, and if necessary, get some coaching on this. This is something that I reached out and got coaching on, is specifically how to empower and enable my own team so that I could learn how to do this. And at the time, I didn't think I was centering myself, but I was. And as I looked back in hindsight, I was like, no, I genuinely was prioritizing my own success or my own perceived success or how I thought my leaders would see me being successful over empowering my team. I was. And that was a hard lesson to learn. This next one is a little bit hard as well. And this is all about listening. And there's two kinds of listening and not centering yourself. So the first kind, I think, is a little bit easier because it involves not centering yourself in conversation about how someone else is feeling. So if you are dealing with an employee or someone on your team, or frankly, even peers or anybody else, and they're talking about themselves, you just listen and you talk about them. I think that this interpersonal kind of listening is sometimes the most important when it comes to not centering yourself as a leader, because this is how you're making someone feel valued and respected and heard, is by actually listening to them and not talking about yourself. And I see leaders making the mistake sometimes, and this is an easy one to fall into, so no judgment, of becoming friends with their employees in a way that actually holds back their employees' growth, because the employee is talking about themselves and their issues, and then the leader will come in and talk about, oh yeah, that's impacting my goals, or this is impacting me, and they just start talking about themselves. And I know this is going to sound terrible, but as a leader, sometimes it is easy to think that what you are going through as a leader is frankly more important, right? And that's an issue, and that is genuinely centering yourself. And so if somebody's talking about their struggles, even if that seems small compared to the stress you're carrying, hey, that's your job. You are a leader. You are supposed to carry that larger amount of stress, and you are supposed to work through that on your own, or with your own leadership, or with your own support system, not with your own employees. So let your employees talk about themselves, meet them where they are, and help them where they are, and don't turn the conversation into something about you, right? And again, we know not to do that in our personal lives. We know that that's kind of a no-no, but think about it at work too. If you're talking to your boss and your boss then just like loses it and starts talking about how hard their life is, that is incredibly aggravating. And when I was coming up in my career and leaders above me did that, I always got frustrated, because I remember we were doing these go lives and I was having to stay up night after night after night. I was going to my boss and I'm like, girl, I'm tired. Like, I can't keep pulling all-nighters for this go live. And she's like, oh my gosh, I'm under so much pressure. And she just started talking about her. And then I'm like comforting her instead of getting support from my leadership and solving my problem, right? And if you think back to different points in your career, that may have happened to you too. But when you're a leader, this is your opportunity not to do the same thing. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, is to recognize I'm in a leadership role. It's not just a management role, it's a leadership role now. And I need to make sure that if somebody's having a struggle or a problem, that I help them with that and I listen to them. So just really, really listening to and hearing people and keeping the conversation centered on them. Now, it's a little bit different if the challenge they're having, I would say, is in conflict with business goals. So you may need to give them a little bit of a perspective about the business side of things after you've heard them out, after you've listened, after you've validated and supported them. As a leader, sometimes you do need to share that perspective. But in that conversation, anything you're responding with is either about the person or it's about the business. It's never about you. That's the important thing to keep in mind with listening. The second kind of listening that's important to not center yourself is to actually gather feedback, input, and other people's thoughts on decisions that you're making as a leader. You want to make sure people are included in your decisions. And in order to do that, you have to actually hear them and you have to listen to them. And it's okay to have a healthy debate. But just like when you're listening interpersonally, when you're listening when it's like decision time, you need to make sure that what you're staying focused is on the perspective of what's good for the business, as well as the perspective about what's good for the person and for the team. And that you're, again, not thinking about what's good for me. And let's use an example of a good leader again and really listening. So I've been at companies that have had their ups and downs financially. It's completely normal. What I remember about leaders is when they put the people above themselves. And so an example of that is I had been in situations where profits were very, very lean and we may not have hit financial targets, but the leaders sacrificed their bonuses that they may have still earned so that the employees could get bonuses. When leaders are making decisions that are, again, for the betterment of the company and the betterment of the people ahead of what's good for them, again, that's what makes them great leaders, and that's what makes them memorable leaders. I remember every leader in my life who's ever made a decision like that very, very fondly, and I respect them immensely for doing that. And I also remember the opposite. I've also been at companies that were struggling financially, and the executive team still took their bonuses, and the people didn't get bonuses, even though they had really worked hard to get what revenue they had, and even though it was, frankly, leadership's decisions that had led them to not be profitable in those years. So just think really, really hard about how you're making decisions and how you're really listening to different inputs that aren't an echo chamber so that you can sanity check yourself as well. I think that's so important to get different inputs and listen to them, because yes, as leaders, we're used to making good decisions and frankly having to make hard decisions. But in order to make sure that you've got a balanced perspective as a leader, you do need to listen to what people have to say. It's not easy. The third way to actively demonstrate that you're not centering yourself is with recognition. And recognition of other people is so powerful. So I love it when leaders are authentic and genuine and they recognize and celebrate the accomplishments of their teams and their team members, even going so far as when they're getting recognition, they pass on credit to the team and publicly thank and acknowledge that it's the team who actually did that work. And especially when it's genuine, I think we've all seen leaders who do that where it comes off as being very disingenuine, and unfortunately that isn't quite the same. So make sure that you know how you can recognize your team and people on your team and the contributions of peers and everybody else, because this really gives credit and it acknowledges the work that they've done. And everybody wants to know that their work matters, just like everybody wants to be heard and they want their voices to be heard and they want their opinions to be factored in. Everybody wants to know that their work is actually being recognized and that leadership knows what they've done. And so I'm just going to use another example of nobody wants to work for somebody where they're not sure what that person is saying in rooms they're not in. And what I mean by that is I think we've all worked with or for leaders who definitely like to take all the glory and who are very much about making themselves look good. And obviously, making yourself look good is centering yourself. And when you're a leader, it's not just your direct accomplishments that you get credit for and make you look like a good leader. It's how well you lead your team. So if your team is doing well and you're recognizing your team, everybody knows that means you're a good leader. So it's really self-centered and short-sighted to not give recognition and credit to your own team. It is very apparent to the leaders above you and around you that you are maybe not the most mature leader if you feel like you have to keep grabbing all the credit for yourself. Another thing that you can do to make sure that you're not centering yourself is by giving support to your team and to the people you work with. And support can look like access to resources, mentorship, training, and giving them encouragement without overshadowing your team's achievements. So this is a way that you're actively lifting up your team and your team members. And again, you can do this with peers too, but definitely make sure you're doing this with your direct teams, is giving them opportunities to grow and learn. Just like we talked about with empowerment, this one with support is very, very similar, where you're showing you're invested in their growth. You're actively spending your time supporting and developing them and not just worried about your own growth and development. There's lots of fun ways you can do this. With my teams in the past, we've done fun things like office hours where people can just drop in and chat and it's about them and their concerns and their needs. We've also done trainings where the leaders are an active part of the training and they show that they're invested in the people. This is one of the things I loved about a company that I recently came from, which is that every office I was in, all of the leadership made sure that they were hands-on and involved in all of the core training that went on, and that they were also active in the employee resource groups, and so that they put their time and effort into supporting things that were of interest to their employees, as well as things that help develop them. So even if we had like fun activities or anything that was, actually organized by the employees, not just formal training, leadership always made sure that some group of leaders was involved in every single different activity that happened, so that our people would get face time with those leaders. And I've also worked at companies where people in leadership roles would make sure, like, not just office hours, but do coffee chats and drop-ins and team lunches. So those things aren't just for fun. It's not just, oh, let's get out of the office and have lunch. Yes, that's awesome. We all like to get out of the office to have lunch every once in a while. But also just to make sure that that's a time where the leaders are there and they talk to the team and they're creating opportunities to then listen to the team. That's something I enjoyed coming up at multiple levels, was these less formal opportunities to talk to leadership where they're interested in people's opinions and interested in their inputs and thoughts and their struggles. So it's a great way to keep a pulse on your team as well, is to have all these different ways that you're actively involved in supporting them, so that you have visibility into what's going on, you're not losing touch, and you can kind of see firsthand how people are doing. So let's talk about why it's important. I had briefly touched on that if you are doing this right, that you're the kind of leader that people remember, and that's nice, but that's still also about you, right? I mean, honestly, it kind of is. But when you're doing this right for your team, it's really important because it helps team morale. You're fostering a positive work environment where team members feel valued and respected and included. This is incredibly powerful for morale and job satisfaction, is people feeling like what they're doing is important and it matters and they're included. So team morale is priceless. Not centering yourself is also a great way to create an environment of collaboration, which leads to more diverse perspectives, better ideas, and better outcomes, as well as, again, making people feel more included because they're able to collaborate on solutions together instead of having somebody dictate things to them all the time. This also can lead to growth, because when leaders take that step back and are not focused on being so prominent and making everything about them, it gives team members an opportunity to learn and demonstrate growth professionally, as well as growing their own leadership skill. One of the biggest benefits to not centering yourself is also trust. Because when a leader isn't centering themselves, their teams and their team members are trusting that that leader is acting for the benefit of the team and the benefit of the company. And it creates so much more interpersonal trust when the team doesn't have to worry that their leader is taking credit or making everything about them or just acting out of self-interest. So it's a well-earned and well-placed trust in leaders who aren't centering themselves. When leaders are seen as part of the team rather than above it, this leads to stronger and more cohesive teams as well. One of the other major benefits of not centering yourself as a leader is sustainable success. Sustainable success comes from building a strong, capable team, not from the efforts of one individual. Leaders who don't center themselves create a resilient and adaptable organization. It also prevents having a single point of failure. It may feel satisfying for everybody to see you as the go-to leader and not see your team that way. It can be really ego validating, right? But fundamentally, the leadership above you is very concerned about that. They don't want any single point of failure. They don't want to think a team is going to fail if this leader isn't there. So while it can be nice to be the shining star, when you move into a leadership role, that's not your role anymore. You're not the SME. You're not the shining star. You're not the superhero who pulls through all the go lives. You're the leader that is raising up and teaching the organization how to be those shining stars, and you're making sure that they shine. So it's a little bit of a mindset shift as a leader, is to realize it genuinely isn't about you. It's about your ability to grow your team and to create other more effective leaders. And that is genuinely what you're measured by the leaders above you, is your ability to do that. So when you think of your own success, it's not just about your metrics, which is hard. That's a hard pill to swallow because I love my metrics. But it is really about your ability to grow and sustain a team. I think it's really important to acknowledge that the best leaders understand the value of their team, prioritize collective success over individual success, and especially over personal glory, and create an environment where everyone can thrive. I do have one caveat here, and this is a personal story, a personal professional story, I should say. I think it's important to note that not centering yourself isn't about being selfless, and it isn't about being a doormat. It's knowing how to show up in a way where you're focused on your team and the company and not yourself without losing yourself. And I say that as a woman because sometimes as female leaders, I feel like we get put in a little bit of this maternal role where we start to feel like our needs don't matter. And so what you want to do is learn how to not center yourself, but again, not lose yourself either. And the example I have is that, I've mentioned that I struggled with not centering myself in some ways and being able to empower the team. But one mistake I've made when growing leaders is sometimes putting too much into them. So kind of overcorrecting, where I ignored red flags or I put up with them treating me, frankly, badly for too long. So I had a situation where I had a direct report and I was very focused on growing her and lifting her up and getting her promoted and getting her ready for the next promotion. And I genuinely believed in her. But what happened was we were so focused on her that somehow the balance shifted a little bit and she felt like she could talk to me in a really abrasive and derogatory way. And so we got into this situation where she was repeatedly spicy with me, and she would get frustrated about certain situations or things she was being asked to do. Not just asked to do by me, but by the organization, and things she was asked to do by HR, and things she was asked to do by my boss. So this wasn't anything about me, but she was taking it out on me, basically. And I had to sit down and set a boundary with her. And so I think it's really important to note that not centering yourself doesn't mean not having boundaries. So if a conversation is about the other person, you let it be about the other person. But that doesn't mean that you are never there to champion yourself if you need to. And so what happened in this situation is that she'd been spicy with me for a few weeks, and I really wanted to handle this with care because I cared about her and valued her, but I did need to let her know that she kind of crossed the line with me with how she was speaking to me. So I prepared for the conversation and went to my leadership and used some of my other internal resources to prepare for how to have the conversation about not yelling at me, her boss. And I did. I sat down and I had the conversation as planned, and I was like, I need to give you some feedback. I haven't really felt good about some of our conversations lately. I feel like you're getting a little bit heated with me, and I need to let you know that that's not the relationship I want to have. That's not how I want to be spoken to. That's not how either of us should be speaking to the other person. And what was really interesting is that she got a little bit spicy in the conversation again. And she's like, well, I'm really frustrated about XYZ, which, I knew, right? And I'm like, I understand your frustration and that's valid, but you can be frustrated without speaking to me this way. And I need you to not speak to me this way. And she expressed that she felt like we had the kind of relationship where we could talk to each other like that. And I said, there's no relationship where I want to be spoken to like that. And I feel like we have the kind of relationship where we can kind of negotiate boundaries together and talk about what works and doesn't work for each of us. So it wasn't my most fun conversation. And like I said, I'd been working so hard to not center myself that it was actually a little bit hard to then stand up for myself. First, I was a little bit shocked that she was acting like this. And second, especially when it wasn't initially well received. But afterwards, she didn't fuss at me again. So my point here is that as adults, we're all responsible for managing our emotions and managing our behaviors. And if someone is being disrespectful to you, it's okay to sit down and have a respectful conversation about your needs and boundaries, no matter what your role is. And it doesn't contradict not centering yourself, because you still deserve to be treated with respect. So I'd say that keep an eye on that, because if you are like me, where you've struggled with one or two aspects in learning to not center yourself, and then you get in a situation like this, don't let it go on for too long. Make sure that you have the conversation at the right time and in the right way, where you set aside time for it. You're not co-opting their time. You're creating your own time with the person to give them this feedback and set this boundary. And still be gentle and respectful about it, but definitely make sure that you're articulating that this just doesn't work for you, and that's okay. The other thing I want to point out about not centering yourself is that this is actually a spectrum that follows you in your career. And so I don't know how many of you have picked up on this as we've been talking, but it's really interesting because I come from companies that have really structured development plans and promotion criteria and levels and skills, all that. I think the consulting world is a really good example, because interpersonal skills are so critical in consulting, because you're always working with teams, you're always working with clients, and you're always responsible for growing and developing the next wave of consultants underneath you as you continue to progress. What I think is interesting is we don't use the same words, but when we're talking about earlier career people and we talk about not taking things personally, recognizing something isn't about you, focusing on the situation, learning to listen to other people, we use different words, but it is fundamentally the same thing. Is it's learning not to center yourself early in your career, and then understanding what that looks like in a different way as a leader. So I want you to think about that, because I think that all of the things that we just said in terms of how to make sure you're not centering yourself as a leader, those are also true for earlier career folks. So if you're a leader working on your own not centering yourself, definitely take these tips that we talked about. If you're a leader growing earlier career folks and you're noticing things like defensiveness and grabbing credit and doing some of these, less optimal behaviors, think about that as well, that not centering yourself looks a little bit different in earlier career folks, but it is the same thing. And that's a great skill for people to start learning as they progress through their career journey, so that they're then better prepared when they're in leadership roles, and the impact is even greater if they are centering themselves. So I hope this was helpful. I think this is a very important skill that can be learned. I think that you should ask people around you for feedback if you're not sure if you do this. Or, like I said, just take a more critical eye on yourself and your own behavior. And no matter where you fall in the centering yourself spectrum, focusing on these 4 things we just talked about to make sure that you are centering the team and the business and not yourself. But again, definitely feeling comfortable setting boundaries and sticking up for yourself when you need to. I'd say another thing that we don't talk about enough is that this is part of the reason some leadership teams struggle is within a peer group, the leaders are focused on their own goals and priorities and success, and are not able to have constructive conversations about the success of the larger group, the organization, or themselves as a leadership team, because everybody is there representing their own interests. So when I've been on dysfunctional leadership teams, that dysfunction 9 times out of 10 has completely stemmed from the fact that each of the leaders, or at least most of them, were centering themselves, their interests, their concerns, their problems, and they were unable to have conversations about the greater benefit that they could bring collectively to the organization, or how they could collaborate as a leadership team to make sure that their teams were supported. Sharing knowledge, sharing tips, really focusing on what they could do to create a better employee experience and to have a more successful business. That is what leadership teams collectively should be focused on. And like I said, I've been on some dysfunctional leadership teams where that was not the case. And unfortunately, that's usually a top-down issue, because if the leader who's running that leadership team isn't able to not center themselves, they can't teach their leaders how to do it. And they frankly don't even recognize that it's dysfunctional behavior. But when you look at like the dysfunctions of a team, which I love, by the way, but if you look at specifically leadership teams, that's where leadership teams get dysfunctional, is when people are not pulling together towards a common goal, but are only interested in themselves. So something to keep in mind. We've talked a lot about how not centering yourself benefits your team, and we've talked a little bit about how it benefits your company in the bigger picture, but also really think about your peer relationships and the leadership teams you're on. And if you think there's a challenge there, I think it's worth having a conversation with your leader about how you can get your leadership team on the same page so that that collective group is focused on the right things. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the discussion today. Please leave a comment or a question down below if you've got anything to add, or if you want clarification on anything. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much.